Continue. Okay, so we're officially, I guess, started now. So welcome everybody to this symposium on disordered and amorphous functional material. This is organized by the Thomas Young Center. My name is Johannes Lischner, and I am the spokesperson of the functional material interest group of the Thomas Young Center. Now, as a community of sort of atomistic modelers, you might get suspicious that we're slightly biased against amorphous and disordered materials. For example, when you look at the codes that we develop as a community, they're typically geared towards periodic materials, which of course these systems are not. But you know, on the other hand, these amorphous material are hugely important in applications. You know, think of electronics or solar energy conversion. So we thought we organized this a symposium to really put the spotlight onto these systems and also on the researchers who are bold enough to study them. Now, the first one the first speaker is Volker Deringer. He's an associate professor at Oxford in chemistry since last year. He obtained a PhD at the University of Aachen in 2014, and then since 2015, he was a research fellow at the University of Cambridge as first an Alexander von Humboldt fellow, and then later as a Leverhulme early career fellow. So Volker, we're looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Johannes, for the kind introduction. And let me start by saying I'm absolutely delighted to be here to sort of virtually at least meet people in the Thomas Young Center and to see that there's a meeting of people who are specifically interested in these disordered and fully amorphous solids and how we might model them. I want to do two things today. So I want to give you a brief overview of the methodologies that I've been using in my research in the recent years, and want to give you a quick introduction to machine learning driven atomic scale modeling. And then I wanted to discuss a couple of points where I think the field might be going in the future and illustrate them with some recent results that we've been having. So in atomistic modeling, I usually start by showing this cartoon and say that everything boils down to knowing the potential energy surface of a given material. So if I'm studying carbon, I want to know what are the energies and forces as a function of where on this surface I am. I might have diamond in a minimum down here, this carbon nanotube in a higher lying minimum, and with quantum chemical methods such as DFT, we can now very accurately describe these energy surfaces at selected points. And there's been a lot of progress in that. But amorphous materials are one of those cases when we're really interested in much higher lying regions and in much more complicated atomistic structures. So during my PhD, I sort of grew up as a DFT person, and I was looking for something that can do a bit larger systems than DFT and give us still the same accuracy. And over the recent years, this has been one of the emerging topics in the field, to try and use what is at first sight a rather non-chemical and non-physical approach to say I have a high dimensional function, which in this case is the energy, as a function of a couple of variables, my positions, and I want to infer the shape of this potential energy surface just based on data points. So I have a few accurate calculations that I'm able to do. I can't sample the entirety of this surface, but I can sample a couple points, and I make the best possible fit to these points. Now, the difference between machine-learned potentials and classical force field that we're all familiar with is that in these models, I don't assume that I know the shape of the function. I'm not defining force constants between atoms. I'm not defining angular terms. I'm just showing data to my model, and I want to make the best possible approximation to that. My own research is in atomistic force field-based modeling, but of course, machine learning is having a major impact in all various areas of materials chemistry. And there's just a couple of really nice overview articles that I'd like to recommend if you're interested in that general area. So to make a machine-learned force field, you need 3 ingredients. And the first thing is to choose where exactly you want to sample your potential energy surface. So you build a reference database, and this is a snapshot of some disordered carbon structure. And you choose very carefully where you want to do your reference calculations. And the work in my own group, which I've recently started, is mainly focused on this side of the methodology. So we think very carefully about which structures exactly do we want to put into the training, because the quality of every model depends on the quality of its input data. Once you have your data, you need a mathematical formalism to describe the atomic structures. Those are often called descriptors or features. And finally, you need the potential fit itself. So that's the regression task and the way by which we build the model. There's 3 main methods, and in each of them, there's lots of different developments. The first approach uses artificial neural networks, which mimic the function of neurons in the brain. So you have a function describing your atomic structure, and you have a target property, which is the energy of an atom. And you have lots of mathematical functions that are linked together using weights. And your task is now given a set of data to adjust the weights so long until you have the best possible model. My own work is currently mainly focused on kernel methods. The specific approach was developed by Albert Bartok and Gabor Jani in Cambridge originally. This is where I've been for a while. They're based on the idea that once I have a couple of structures in my reference database, those here, I can go and look at the energy of a new structure here in red by comparing it with all these entries that I have in my database. So I use a kernel or similarity function, which is a similarity measure between 0 and 1, and which tells me how similar two environments are. I'll come back to that point.
Sorry, Volker, sorry to interrupt, but I think there's a problem with the slides. I think we're still, I still see slide 3, machine learning driven materials modeling. It seems you're talking about something else.
I'm on slide 4. I can stop sharing and put it back on. Maybe that.
Yeah, I'm having the same problem.
Let me just put a slide share back on. Sorry about that. Okay, does it work now?
Not yet there. It says Volker Deringer has started screen sharing, but I don't see anything yet.
Same here.
Can you see it now?
I'm just going to pause for a minute.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. Can you see the can you see me moving between the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So sorry about that. An overview of the methodology. So again, 3 ingredients that you need to make a potential, and I want to illustrate this using amorphous carbon, which is one of the classical materials that in this community we're interested in. You see 3 different snapshots of amorphous carbon made in molecular dynamics simulations at various densities. And you see how they are strongly dependent on how dense your sample is. So you have a coexistence of 4-fold, 3-fold, and even 2-fold bonded atoms in blue, green, and yellow. So just to walk through these 3 ingredients that you need, the first thing is a database of reference calculations. So I've done small molecular dynamics calculations here with a small number of atoms, taking them, randomizing them, and cooling them very quickly, much as we would do it in DFT-based simulations. And after that, I'm taking these data points, calculating energies and forces for them, putting that into my database, and iteratively running new simulations, exploring new structures, and building a reference of about a couple thousand small DFT calculations. Very briefly about these descriptors that I mentioned. So the task is now to describe the atomic structure in a suitable mathematical way and to build a machine learning model from that. So as an example, I'm showing you a potential energy scan for a dimer of carbon atoms, just 2 atoms in vacuum. And I've done some DFT calculations here in blue. The general features, of course, we bring the atoms together, they go through a bonding minimum, and then if we bring them close together, we get repulsion. If I'm fitting a machine learning model with a general structural descriptor, this is this smooth overlap of atomic positions kernel, which is extremely powerful in quantifying atomic structure. I see that I'm getting a very good fit in this region where I have data, but I get a really rubbish result in the region where I don't have data, which is just a consequence of the fact that machine learning models need to extract this information from given data. They don't know in themselves what this dimer curve is going to look like. So if I give it reference data and I'm staying reasonably close to these data, things are fine. But if I go to rather strange interatomic distances, there's no reference data. And because the model is so flexible, it is going to do strange things. Another way to try and make a machine learning potential is by using only the distances between atoms as descriptor or as feature. So I'm only looking at pairs of atoms at a time, and then I get a potential energy curve which looks like this for my dimer. So it isn't very good, but it gets the basic features right. It gets the bonding minimum here, and it does capture the repulsion. I could go and build another machine learning model using the distances and the angles as descriptors. That makes things a bit better. And finally, I could go and combine these n-body terms with a descriptor that now describes the complete atomic environment. And we've looked in quite some detail on how can you actually combine the different parts of descriptors to make a potential which is robust. By robust, I mean that it captures the repulsion, for example, at small distances, and which is still accurate, giving you good energies and forces near the minimum where you're interested. So in this way, we write the total energy of our system as a sum of machine-learned energies, which depend either on these two-body terms or the angle terms or the many-body descriptor. And that together gives us the gap regression model. We're determining these parameters here once, and then we're keeping them fixed. And we can make energy predictions for arbitrary atomistic systems. I'm showing you the equation for the energy here. What we're really after sometimes is the forces. So that makes for a longer equation, but we can also learn interatomic forces and run molecular dynamics simulations. Good. The first thing to do, check the accuracy of the prediction. So here's a scatter plot of forces on atoms from the machine learned model versus the ground truth. You see it's looking quite all right. It's not perfect. There is some scatter. And this is particularly a challenging thing in amorphous materials, because you are never going to reach that kind of accuracy that you normally want for crystalline phases. But that's all right, because you are dealing with very highly disordered phases and you're running long molecular dynamics simulations. So one thing that I can't stress enough is that it's not enough to just look at a numerical error of any force field. You want to look at physical properties and how those are being predicted. So here's an example for amorphous carbon, elastic properties. The Young's modulus here, various experimental observations in colored points, and the machine learning model in red. And you see it works pretty well over the whole range of densities. All these are tests and validations, but we can now go and do real scientific applications with these potentials. These are simulations that were run by my collaborator Miguel Caro in Aalto University in Finland. So we've been looking at carbon together for a long time. We're taking individual atoms and throwing them at a substrate. So we're mimicking the deposition process by which thin films of carbon grow. And growing this film one by one, we see atoms starting from somewhere above the surface, hitting the slab, bouncing around. You see how the atomic energy predicted by the gap spikes at the moment that the atom hits the surface, and then it settles in slightly above the energy of diamond. Again, we can go and compare with experiments, and the one quality criterion for simulations of amorphous carbon is the count of sp3 atoms, which is up to 90% in experiments. And we were super pleased to see that this potential and simulations driven by this potential were able to quantitatively capture the sp3 count in these carbon films. So now you're looking at a system size of about 10,000 atoms and a quantum mechanically accurate prediction. We've then gone and expanded that much further. And one question, for example, is, well, how do these films behave if you grow them at different impact energies? So here's a range of films obtained at very different ion impact energies. You see that at typical energies where the diamond-like films are being grown, we have a rather smooth and dense film. If you have too high impact energy, you're going to damage the surface. So you can look at how thick this sp2-rich surface layer becomes. At low energy, you're growing more sp2-rich atoms. The color coding shows you the similarity to diamond. So yellow atoms are similar to diamond and blue ones aren't. I'll go back to this in a moment. So by describing these deposition mechanisms over a wide range of energies, not only do we get nice structures to look at and just enjoy looking at the structures, but we can also infer something about the mechanism by which these films grow. So what we've extracted from the simulation trajectories over many, many events is this picture here, where if you have carbon atoms at low energy attaching to the surface, they grow sp2 structures directly around the impact site. Whereas if you shoot atoms on the surface with high energy, you induce a process which is called pinning. So you're kicking atoms away from the impact site. You're actually depleting the region right around the center, but you're growing an sp3-rich film left and right of the impact site. This has been under debate for quite a while, and we've now been able to match our simulation trajectories to these models and say this is our proposed mechanism for how these films grow. Okay, so summarizing, we're able to make accurate atomistic structures of amorphous materials. What is next? So one thing that I think is quite exciting is to be able to go from purely structural modeling to getting back some chemistry from those models. I've said before, those are very non-chemical models. They don't have any chemistry. Can we get chemistry out of them? And if you're looking back at this sketch that I made at the beginning, there's two aspects that could be particularly useful for amorphous materials. One thing is that we are using structural descriptors, which we can sort of borrow to quantitatively analyze the structure in disordered phases. The other thing is that, as we've just said before, we are fitting atomic energies, we are fitting local energies, and the question arises, can we interpret these local energies? Do they have a meaning? We've done a series of simulations for amorphous silicon, so this is another one of those textbook materials where we're quenching a range of structures with different cooling rates, and thereby we're able to make a finely controlled range of samples with different densities. And now we can go and study the structural ordering as we make progressively more relaxed silicon samples. The traditional indicators would have been, for example, the tetrahedrality. This is the Q parameter, which is 1 for ideal tetrahedra. And the medium range order would be quantified, for example, by counting the 6-membered rings. Recall in diamond, you have only 6-membered rings, and in these amorphous films, you go up to almost half of them. I've shown you this many-body descriptor before, the smooth overlap of atomic positions. And now instead of using it to fit a potential, I can use it to quantify the similarity of atomic environments with respect to the crystalline phase. So this is information that's extracted from the SOAP kernel. And you see that I'm essentially recovering the information that my empirical indicators would have given me, but I'm getting everything in the same mathematical framework. And I can, of course, apply this approach to quantify similarity of amorphous phases with any crystalline form, whether that's diamond or not. So I think this is an interesting way of looking at amorphous structures. I can go further and go back to these machine learned energies. And I've asked you, do they have a meaning? I've drawn here a little fragment from one of these amorphous silicon structures, and the color coding shows you what the individual atoms machine learned energy. So blue atoms have an energy that is close to that in diamond. and red atoms have high energy. And intuitively, this would fit with our expectation. So the tetrahedral atom down here, low distortion, locally stable. The defect here pops up with high energy. Now, of course, you can say maybe you've just picked out this one. What about the rest? Now, of course, we have to look at the distribution in the whole systems. You can look at histograms of these local energies, and you see again, this is a less relaxed structure. This is a more relaxed structure, and the center of gravity of these local energies coincides quite well with the experimental excess energy. But by being able to look at individual atoms, we can actually do more. We can say, let's go and correlate the structural similarity on the one hand, so this is the horizontal axis, with the machine-learned local energy on the other axis. And by plotting this for all the atoms in the dataset, and by having enough atoms to actually make a statistically significant statement, we can say we can sort out the roles of different types of atomic environments. So in this case, we are looking at threefold bonded atoms, which are commonly called dangling bonds. They have high atomic energies, they are unfavorable, and they have a fairly sharply defined peak in terms of structure, because there's only so many ways you can remove one atom from a tetrahedron. Fivefold bonded atoms are much more spread out in terms of their structural signature, and they are lower in energy. In fact, some of these fivefold coordinated atoms are lower in energy than strongly distorted fourfold atoms. And this is what makes it possible to have these defects at all. This is why, in fact, these structure models are slightly more stable than the WWW model in DFT computed energies. And you can look at these distributions and see where it comes from. You can link this to electronic analysis, these electronic densities of states. And again, for the threefold atoms, if you're projecting onto these atoms, you have high density of states at the Fermi level for those threefold atoms, and almost none for fivefold atoms in properly relaxed amorphous silicon. So we can go back and extract some information about local environments and try to understand better what is the stability of these phases. Very briefly, another direction, new ways to make reference databases. I've said before, the quality of the model depends on what kind of data I put in. And a while ago, I've asked myself, can I build databases for fitting without knowing anything about structure? So can I randomly place atoms in cells and do calculations for that and make potentials using just that approach? I'm sketching this very crudely here, but it turns out the approach does work. So by starting with just randomized atomic positions and then gradually fitting improved versions of potentials, we can make potentials for materials. Initially, these were experiments for boron, which is one of the challenging cases. So you see how the algorithm gradually discovers what, for example, alpha boron 12 might look like. Those are the crystalline phases. But in fact, if you now go and see what kind of training databases this generates and how you're sampling structured space, you are describing a variety of crystalline phases, but you're also discovering more disordered regions of configuration space. And this is one of the key findings. If we were only after the crystalline phases, we could just put them in the training and we know what they look like. But we want to sample the potential energy surface more broadly. These are proofs of concept for various elemental systems. And I want to show you now how you can go and combine these broadly exploring databases with the hand-built databases that I've shown you before. This is a potential that we've just published for elemental phosphorus, which combines results from a structure search shown here in as gray points with various types of phosphorus structures. We've got phosphorine, we've got the crystalline allotropes, and a range of liquid phases. And all this is now combined into a single potential fitting database. That allows us to have very high accuracy in the regions where we need it. For example, for the exfoliation of phosphorine, which is very tricky to get right and to completely capture all these van der Waals interactions. But at the same time, because of this high diversity of structures that we're sampling, we are able to also describe more disordered phases. And of course, because this is a meeting of people who like disordered and amorphous phases, I'm going to show you some first results for liquid phosphorus. This is the molecular liquid at low pressure, P4 units floating around. You see in the radial distribution a clear first peak and then essentially a structureless region. You see a very clear peak at 60 degrees. Those are P4 molecules which are basically intact. This is the network liquid which you get at high pressure. So if you compress the structure in A and you break up the bonds, you get a disordered liquid structure, and you see the radial distributions and angle distributions reflected. In all the cases, is the prediction from the Machinelearning model as solid lines, very close to DFT predictions with the dashed lines. And now, of course, that puts us in a position to look much more closely at, for example, amorphous phosphorus, which we're hoping to do in the future. Can I say something very briefly? I'm aware we've had a bit of a delay with the...
Sure,
is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Yes. The final thing I wanted to just flag is how might we go from the pure structural modeling and from the pure atomistic simulations to practical applications. And I'd like to go back to carbon materials, as those are used in all sorts of electrodes, sensors, coatings. And I've shown you very large carbon slabs, but I want to make a case that sometimes you want to make very small carbon structures, such as this one here, with just a couple hundred atoms. And that's when you want to study chemical reactivity. Rather than just this elemental material, you might say, what happens if you hydrogenate your carbon surface, or in fact, you oxidize it? So we've been spending some time trying to sort out what are the chemical reactions that are taking place at the surface of these materials. We can go and explore the different motifs that form in hydrogen atmospheres, and we can also simulate the oxidation process. So you see here carbon monoxide actually flying away if you're heating your slab too strongly. And if you're a chemist, you recognize these fragments that we draw in organic chemistry. Those are present at the amorphous surfaces. Another point where carbon materials are of the greatest interest is energy storage. So you can make porous carbon materials like this one here, which are used in batteries, catalysts, supercapacitors, because you have pores where you can store ions. So this is another line of research where we said, let's make small representative structure models of amorphous solids and try to understand the chemical behavior. In this case, we wanted to see what happens if you insert different metals in there in the electrochemical energy storage. So we go calculate many possible structures, putting, in this case, lithium ions in there and comparing with experimental voltage curves. So this is another indicator for what might be happening inside the material. We can look at local information. Again, we can get atomic information out of these structures using the machine learning driven simulations, but also using established bond analysis tools, for example, looking at the charges as the lithium ions intercalate in this structure. And we can use tools such as this one. I'm just going to put the link up here, which we've used quite a lot over time. Finally, what I wanted to flag, this is from a little perspective paper I've written recently. If you think of how these methods fit together, the main thrust initially has been to use DFT to calculate reference data to make machine learned potentials. I've tried to argue in the last part of this presentation that you can also go back and create libraries of small scale structures and study them again with DFT. So it is really going in both directions. But there's more. With these potentials in hand, with the ability to make accurate simulations, we can now link much better to what our colleagues are doing in the lab and to connect with various experimental techniques, having system sizes of tens of thousands of atoms and more. And in return, something that I think will also be quite exciting is trying to get tailor-made experimental benchmarks to properly validate our potentials and to make sure we're actually simulating the right thing. And finally, you could say, if you have this bridging between the methods and you have the ML potential as one part of this ecosystem, you might end up making closer connections between DFT and the experiments themselves. For example, by predicting electronic spectra or the voltage curves that I've just shown you. So with that, I'd like to quickly summarize. I've tried to convince you that machine learned potentials are increasingly popular as tools for atomistic simulations. They are accurate, they can deal with very diverse environments, and they're pretty fast. I've shown you one recent example where we tried to get more information beyond just the force field modeling, trying to get atomistic insights into amorphous phases. I've shown you a route for making general purpose potentials, including structure search, but also liquid and amorphous phases. And I've said very briefly how we might combine these methods with experiments and with the established DFT approaches that the community has been developing over the last decades. And with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to say thank you to all my collaborators. Special shout out, of course, to Gabor Gianni, who has been my host for the Humboldt Fellowship, then my mentor and my long-term collaborator since then. Colleagues with whom I've worked on carbon, Silicon Davis, of course, Stephen Elliott in Cambridge, many other collaborators that I haven't had time to talk about, the funding bodies who made all this work possible, and finally, I'd like to advertise this one. We've just set up a Twitter account for the new group. We don't have the website yet, but do follow us over there. And I'm really excited to be starting with people here. We're just getting set up and running, and people are absolutely fantastic. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'd like to thank you for your kind attention and for the invitation again. I'm going to put this one up, which is hopefully visible, and happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Volker. That was really fantastic and very interesting. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. One way would be to type your questions into the chat and I can read them out, but the alternative is you can just unmute yourselves and ask. So if there's anything, go ahead now. While people think of questions, I can ask one first. And basically, I was curious about that last part, when you sort of go from sort of the simple systems, just silicon, just diamond, to something where there's actually, you know, different kind of species and reactivity. And I was wondering how big a step it is in terms of sort of developing these machine learning models once you have sort of different kinds of elements and they're reacting. Is that a big step or straightforward?
It's a difficult question because it depends on what you want your potential to be able to do. If you have a rather defined system, we've actually had a visiting student a couple of years back who made a potential for lithium intercalation in carbon. So you're not interested in the full multi-component system, but you're interested in a specific question and you know what your input data have to look like. That's manageable. And I should say, I've been talking a lot about elemental systems because those are just systems that I really like and that I care about. In other areas of material science, people have been studying very complex alloys with machine learning potentials and very, very successfully. So it's not restricted to elemental systems. What I'm suggesting here is two things. First of all, you can use, I'd say, more established methods such as density functional methods if you don't know in the first place what your chemistry is going to look like. I wouldn't know from the top of my head what exactly to put into my reference database to describe all these oxidation processes. I'm hoping to know that in the future, but at the time I was just saying I'm just taking them, doing DFT on them because I know that is going to predict reactivity after I've spent a lot of time just making the potential. The other massive advantage to this that I see in terms of how the community might take up these methods. Running these potentials it's getting more popular and more easy, but it does take a bit of work and getting used to and so on. Being able to put those structural data online and giving them to people who might say, I
Did Volker just disappear?
I think so.
Volker, can you hear us? Muted.
Sorry. Apparently, the after 9 months of all the Zoom and everything working, today is the day where it decides to not work. I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Yes.
Okay, let's maybe give someone else a chance to ask questions. So Aaron Walsh asks that really clear talk, Volker. An alternative to learning the potential energy surface could be to train an amorphous structure generator, i.e. learning bonding motifs and connectivity. Has anyone attempted this using machine learning?
It's a great question. In fact, one of the big areas in that field, I think, is what exactly is your strategy for generating structures? I think there's a distinction you want to make between two different families of approaches. So on the one hand, there's the force fields where you say you need some sort of atomistic structure to go in. That could come from MD, that could come from databases, that could come from if you mean techniques such as the ART, where you're sort of placing positions randomly. It depends on whether you're learning something as a function of atomic structure or not. So there are, of course, a range of machine learning models that take, for example, the chemical composition as input or some other parameters of your amorphous phase. We are only in the business of making atomistic models. So we are always starting from some atomistic structure, but that structure might come from any suitable source. I'm not sure if this fully answers the question, to be honest, but
I don't know if Aaron, do you want to unmute yourself and or?
That's a perfect answer. Thanks, Volker. Yeah, don't worry.
Okay. All right, great. So I think, unfortunately, we should move on. But there are two other questions, one from Ben Slater and one from Harry Geddes in the chat. Volker, maybe you can just reply on the chat.